Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Today PACE members, together with you and your colleague and NGOs and victims of human rights abuses, hosted a side event on the impact of the Magnitsky Act on human rights in the Council of Europe area. So, as you know, Global Magnitsky Act is a powerful tool to combat the feeling of impunity in non-democratic countries. We presented together with you several case studies like Venezuela, Iran, Moldova, Kazakhstan and Russia. And it's a powerful tool to bring to criminal responsibility human rights abusers. I wanted to ask you what's the current status of the Global Magnitsky Act in your country, in Italy. I know you you submitted a legislative proposal in your country, but what are the feedbacks from the side of your colleagues?
Yes, we just put the proposal inside the Senate last week. And we also had a very, very interesting moment to understand better in the Italian Senate how that works. And I believe my colleagues are really curious, very interested in that new idea of tools for human rights. They want to understand better. And for that reason, the side event of today was very, very useful, because we had a legal, a very strong idea of what can happen, or what can be useful, and also about the problem, but also about the solution that we already have organized for that problem. So that's the very interesting. The Parliamentary Assembly already in last session asked all the country to decide to have these tools inside their country legislation, also inside the one of European Union. So I believe that we can do a lot to any member of Parliament of every country, to give them the tools to let understand better all their colleagues, and to have different global act inside every country parliament.
Mm-hmm. So coming back to your last point, I'd like to ask you, as you have a broad expertise on the application of Magnitsky Law, how can the Council of Europe states transpose the Magnitsky Law into their national legislation, so concretely?
Sure. Well, I think that it's very early days with these kinds of global laws to provide accountability to for victims by holding to account people who are gross violators of human rights in various governments, as well as those involved in grand corruption. We only have a few jurisdictions where this is now possible at the national level, which includes the United States, Canada, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. There are proposals being discussed, of course, in Italy and a number of other countries. The European Union is considering a proposal from the Dutch government to do this European-wide. But these tools are so important, in fact, because of our experience with international human rights in the last number of decades, where many countries around the world have signed on to international treaties, but especially authoritarian governments are not respecting when, for example, regional institutions like the European Court of Human Rights issue judgments, for example, that a political prisoner is arbitrarily detained. These kinds of judgments are often ignored. Similarly, opinions of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention are ignored. And so the question for human rights defenders is, what do you do at that point when on these kinds of individual cases you're not getting much traction, even if you're naming and shaming, and even if you're winning legal cases internationally? And so this is one way to get at that problem, by going after the worst of the worst in any given country. And by looking at, for example, the person who's the head of the prison system in a country that imprisons political prisoners, or someone who runs the security service that it oversees widespread torture of victims. By targeting them to be put on these kinds of national lists, what you do is you freeze their assets in those countries. You shut them out from international banking relationships and their ability to do business relationships. You also can impose travel bans or revoke visas to visit various countries. And Europe, of course, is a place of regular destination for various authoritarian leaders from around the world and their ministers. And so by naming and shaming them, not just with words, but with meaningful and substantive actions, you create a real opportunity to force those governments to deal with these issues. And I think the last thing I would say is that it's important to emphasize that these are meant to be tools that can be employed, but then can be rolled back. So if, for example, you're looking at sanctioning the head of a prison system in a country that imprisons political prisoners, a government may go to that person privately and say, we're going to impose these sanctions unless you change your behavior. If they don't, you put that on the list. The government will get very upset, as they do when these sanctions are imposed, and then you say, look, this isn't the end of the story. You can get off the list, but you now need to engage in these specific actions in order to get off the list. And so this is why this tool is really, really needed to be able to be available at the national level, as well as at the regional level, for example, through the EU, and more broadly, of course, through the Council of Europe.
Thank you. And last question for both of you. During the side event, we heard different stories from different backgrounds, so direct testimonies of victims of such abuses. So what would be the benefits for the victims and human rights defenders that are combating with this feeling of impunity, and how they can cooperate with the PACE members in this sense?
Yes, I believe it was very, very important that, because when we speak about human rights, we have to understand it's not just two words. It's real people, real life of real people. And today we have there 3 real people, and every one of them know someone, his father, his mother, his brother, that is now in jail, that have been tortured, that risk his life. And I believe, for example, that exactly these histories are histories of people who nowadays their relatives are alive. So maybe if that country and the people of that country can understand that they can risk to be put in a list, can change and let that people go home, let that people go out from jail, let that people stop torture. So it's a very, very concrete system to help women and men, real women and men.
Yeah, I can't tell you enough, can't emphasize enough from my experience traveling all over the world, including to many authoritarian countries, how much this means to civil society activists, human rights defenders, and victims of abuses to know that there could be accountability. There's great hope for this system that's only getting up and running in only a handful of countries and needs to spread very, very rapidly in order to be effective. But when you look at a country, let's just take an example of like Kazakhstan, right, where there's widespread torture with total impunity. You've had lots of human rights groups, the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, the EU speak out about these kinds of abuses, and nothing happens. People feel hopeless and helpless. If we're able to sanction, individual perpetrators in Kazakhstan that are responsible for gross abuses, somebody like the former Interior Minister Kasimov, who has overseen the prison systems that imprison political prisoners and overseen the security forces that torture people, right? You put someone like that on the list. It isn't just that you've named and shamed them globally, you've made it impossible for them to travel to Europe, or you're blocking assets, but the message sent to people in the country is that your suffering actually matters, and we in the international community actually see and have heard these victim testimonies from so many victims that have been impacted by this particular person's abuses. And that's an incredibly powerful tool. It also sends a message to other people within the Kazakhstan government system as we move this kind of approach forward, that you better watch out what you're doing, because there could be consequences for it. And this isn't just at the ministerial level, but this would be known obviously to individual guards in prisons. And they might say to themselves, wow, if I go and follow these orders and I go beat somebody, for example, I could get listed too. Now, the reality is that these sanctions are focused on gross abusers of human rights, not on individual perpetrators. But the impact within an authoritarian system and the message sent to victims, to me, in my view, can't be underestimated. I think it's exceptionally powerful, and this is why so many governments, when these sanctions have been imposed already in certain situations, get incredibly upset and retaliate against the countries imposing these kinds of sanctions and yell and scream about it so much, because this is actually something that matters, where unfortunately it's become the case that in a lot of judgments of international tribunals or UN working groups or rapporteurs comes and goes. But this is something that stays, and this is something that really matters to these authoritarian leaders.
Thank you very much. We'll definitely monitor how the implementation will be advanced by the Council of Europe member states, and I thank you once again.
Thank you.